Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be building my second Umagwad Acrobat HD0 drone. I've been flying this basic setup for a while and I have been wanting to build a backup, so I thought why not share this with you all as well. I'm going to talk through the build and highlight some basic things I have found that work for building a reliable setup. This is not a tutorial video, so if you're looking for that, you will probably want to find a different video. I did make a drone building tutorial series several years ago, but it is so out of date that I have removed it. Even though this is not a tutorial, you may still probably learn a few things. First, let me go over all the parts that we are going to be using for this build. Everything in this build can be found on my website under the gear section. You will find a link to my website in the description below. We are using a SpeedyBee F4 mini stack for the flight controller and ESC. We are using a Crossfire Nano receiver for the control link with a mini Immortal T antenna. I know most of you all have moved on to ELRS, but I don't feel like learning something new. I'm aware I would have better range with a full-size Immortal T, but the mini Immortal T works for me as I generally stay within 1,000 feet of myself. At some point I may switch to ELRS, which would give me the smaller antenna form factor and better range, but for now I'm staying with Crossfire. For the video system, I'm using HD0. I have the Foxeer HD0 VTX, and I had originally planned on sticking with the Micro V2 camera and using a different lens, but as you will see later on, my camera housing has a stripped screw hole, so I decided to just update and get the Micro V3 camera. For the VTX antenna, I am using the Foxeer Lollipop V4. This antenna has proven to have great performance and has been durable. I have a Panasonic 35 volt 1000 UF capacitor for smoothing electrical noise and spikes. 35 volts is plenty for my setup as I run 3S. You typically want to run a capacitor that is roughly double your battery voltage. I have found that 1000 UF is a good size for protecting the HD0 VTX. It worked well on my 5-inch drone, so I figure it is more than adequate for this smaller setup. For the motors, I'm using the Emax Eco Micro 1407 4100 kV motors. I like these motors for a couple of reasons. They utilize a 5mm nut. The T-motor style mounting frustrates me, particularly when you're out flying and need to swap props. The tiny screws are easy to lose and easy to strip. The other reason is these motors have proven to be durable and reliable. They are very cheap as well. For the beeper, I'm using the ViFly Finder Mini. I had moved away from using a beeper on my drone and had been relying solely on motor beeping, but recently I had some not so fun experiences in trying to find my drone that have made me rethink that decision. On this build, I really didn't know where I would be able to fit a beeper, but I came across the mini beeper from ViFly. I decided to give it a try, and I found I could fit it on pretty easily. It's pretty loud, has a light, and a backup battery, so it checks all the boxes in the drone recovery. And lastly, I'm utilizing the OG Umagwad Acrobat frame. It's not easy to find in stock, but you can reach out to Umagwad, and they keep parts in stock. It has proven to be durable, and I like that it has multiple stacking mounting locations. There are a few downsides to it though. The mounting points are only 20 by 20 and only M2. And it is a solid bottom plate, which could be a problem if you break an arm. Thankfully, the design of the arms helps to alleviate this some, and like I said, it has proven to take a good bit of abuse. One thing I do on all of my builds is to ditch the included screw hardware. Typically, it's not good steel, even if it's steel at all, and it almost always uses button heads. I've stripped so many of these types of screws over the years, so I opt to replace all of those with socket head screws that are made of good hardened steel. Yes, it adds weight, but it's worth it to me to have hardware that is going to last through the bashing. Now that we have the motor installed, it's time to get the ESC ready. I like to dry fit parts several times when I'm doing a build to ensure I get everything placed nicely and to ensure I don't accidentally mess something up when I'm soldering or trimming wires and such. There's nothing worse than having to undo a bunch of the build process, or worse, to trim wires too much and not have any spare wire laying around. I'm going to get the ESC motor pads all tinned with solder, and I'm going to be installing the capacitor and battery lead during this setup. I like the SpeedyBee SC as it provides holes to run the capacitor leads through. Most 4-in-1 ESCs do that these days, but there was a time when this was not the case. It was a real pain in the backside to get both the capacitor and the battery lead soldered to the ESC reliably when this was the case. Thankfully, most manufacturers have learned. I run the capacitor leads all the way through the holes in the ESC, and then I bend them outward on the underside to hold the capacitor in place while I solder on the top side. After that, I'll flip the ESC over and solder the leads on the underside as well, and then trim the excess capacitor lead using a set of snips. This gives a solid connection for the capacitor, and it makes it easier to get the battery lead soldered securely. I also try to keep the leads on the capacitor as short as possible. This improves durability and helps to prevent anything from getting shorted. Prior to doing these things, I used to have all sorts of issues with capacitors. I know, I should have known better, but some of us have to learn the hard way by failing over and over and over again. I've heard you want to have the capacitor as close to the battery power coming in as possible, and as a result, some people choose to install the capacitor right at the LiPo connection. I've never done this because I've always felt it puts the capacitor in a location that is too exposed and increases the potential for it to be damaged. The upside would be more room inside the drone frame, which would be helpful. Am I right or not? What's been your experience if you mount capacitors at the LiPo connector? Are they more likely to get damaged in a crash? Let me know in the comments. Now the camera I've been using on my setups for a long time, back to my 5-inch builds with the HD0 as the video system, is the HD0 Micro V2. It's a great camera, but the lens that it comes with doesn't let you run the camera in full uncropped 16:9 mode without vignetting, so you have to replace it. The newer HD0 Micro V3, however, has an updated lens that gives you the full 16:9 sensor with no cropping and no vignetting. As you'll see later, I have to replace the camera I was going to use because it has a strip nut, so I can't tighten the camera mounting screw. As I finish soldering up the motor leads to the ESC, you'll notice that I run the camera cable under the ESC. I do this to protect the cable, but it also gives some shielding from electrical noise. I'm not sure how much electrical noise affects the HD0 system, but I know in my analog days it made a big difference. So I continue doing that on my digital setups. One other thing to note on my builds is that I leave a bit of slack on my motor wires. I like to leave the slack in case the motor gets knocked off in a crash or the arm breaks. The extra slack helps to prevent the ESC motor wire solder tabs from being pulled and damaged. The downside of doing this is that you need to take extra precautions to keep the slack from getting chopped by a motor. The SpeedyBee ESC has nice notches cut out, so I like to bring the motor wires up from the bottom and solder into the notch, which helps keep the wires in place and makes a nice secure solder joint. With the motors installed and soldered to the ESC, let's do a bit of prep work on the VTX. Previously, I used the HD0 Race V3 VTX on my other Acrobat build. It's been a good VTX as far as performance goes, but durability has not been that great. When I made one change to my builds, which I'll discuss later, the durability drastically improved, and it hasn't been too much of an issue except in a really hard crash. Even so, I decided I wanted to try a different VTX to see if there was any improvement or not. I decided to try the Foxeer HD0 VTX. I really wanted to use the new HD0 Freestyle 2 VTX, but it would make it a bit harder to get my drone under 250 grams weight. So I've opted to not utilize it at this point. From everything I've seen, I think it will check off all the boxes, if I can get the weight of my build down a few more grams. But for now, I'm going to use the Foxeer VTX. Overall, I like the design. It doesn't have a pigtail installed like the HD0 Race V3, and that suits me as better as well, because I always remove the pigtail anyways. It has a nice element to help secure the camera plug, but I do that differently regardless. The one downside is that it doesn't have an antenna locking plate nut glued to the VTX, so you have to hold them while trying to screw in the tiny screws through the locking plate. That's no easy feat, but it is doable. This build is going pretty good so far, aside from installing the VTX antenna backwards. So now would be a great time to nearly screw it all up entirely by destroying the VTX. Sounds like fun, right? Each HD0 VTX has 4 wires: ground, power, TX, and RX. Some of the HD0 VTXs have a plug, some have a pigtail, and some have solder points. I typically prefer having solder points as it gives me the most reliable connection over time. This Foxeer VTX has the solder pads. As I mentioned earlier, this is one thing that kind of drew me to it. The one downside with this VTX though is that these pads are really small. Sometimes when pads are small and close, you can bridge them. I've done that with flight controllers and other components in the past, and I usually don't have too much trouble in rectifying the issue. I have a solder sucker that works pretty well. Simply apply the soldering iron tip to the pads with the bridge solder to get the solder flowing, and then bring the solder sucker close to it and press the button. Sometimes it might take a couple of tries to get it right, but in general it works. So when you think you have it fixed, grab a magnifying glass to examine it closely, and if it looks pretty good, grab your meter, put it into continuity mode, and check it. Some meters beep and some show a resistance value to indicate continuity. Mine is the latter. It shows a 1 if there is no continuity, and varying values otherwise, with 0 being good continuity. So I check the pads, and what do I see? You guessed it, 0. Just what we don't want to see. Great. I repeat this process several times, and I keep having this problem even though close examination of the pads reveals that they are not bridged. Yet the meter doesn't lie. What could be the problem? I get the magnifying glass out to check again, and finally I realize what I believe to be the problem. A slight bit of solder on the ground pad is actually touching a component that sits very close to the ground pad. So I think that maybe I should try my solder wick instead. I look all over for it. I had just seen it on my desk a few days ago before I started this build. I looked for a good while, but never find it. So what other options do I have? The solder sucker isn't working so well because it doesn't seem that the solder wants to flow like it should. I then remember I have a solder flux pen. Now I know some of you swear by adding flux anytime you solder anything, but I found that I typically don't need that as the solder I buy has flux already in it, and flux is messy, so I don't like to use it. It does, however, help solder flow. So I get that pen out, apply some flux, heat it up, using the solder sucker once again, and voila! I finally have good result with the continuity meter. With the VTX all tinned up, let's get it connected to the flight controller and connect the flight controller and ESC and check that everything is good and that we don't have any shorts. The pads for this VTX are on the side, so we want to make sure that when we solder the wires to it, we solder them so that the wires are routed to the inside. We're going to route the wires so that they go between the ESC and the VTX. One thing to note when soldering wires that I should mention is this. You want the exposed part of the wire to be as short as possible. This will keep the wire from inadvertently touching anything else that is soldered. Crashes jar things a bunch, and it's really easy for wires to jostle a bit and create shorts. Another thing is to always twist your wires together. The primary reason is that it helps with electrical noise, having the ground and power twisted. It also helps keep things nice and tidy in this build. And sometimes, like it did for me before, it helps to expose bad solder joints when you put a little stress on the connection with the twisting motion. The wires are all soldered to the VTX, so let's connect it to the flight controller. I want to discuss another point with builds. Be consistent in how you wire things, in particular with wire color. As an example, connecting the RX and TX wires. Several years ago, when I got into this hobby, everyone was running S-bus receivers. Those receivers had 3 wires, red, black, and yellow. Red for power, black for ground, and yellow was a signal wire. The signal wire always went to the RX pad on the flight controller. Well, technically there were cases where it could use the TX, but those were on the fringe, so we'll ignore that for now. Now, when I finally made the switch to Crossfire, it had 4 wires, red, black, yellow, and white. They weren't labeled as TX on the receiver though. TBS thought it made most sense to label them as channel 1 and channel 2. I can't tell you how many times I had to look up the wiring. What finally stuck in my head was to put the yellow to the RX, as I had done all those times with the S-bus, and then just remember that channel 1 was TX and channel 2 was RX. Since the most important thing was the receiver does its transmit its received signal to the flight controller. Since then, yellow always goes to the RX pad on the flight controller in my builds, regardless of the component utilizing it. With everything soldered, let's plug in the flight controller and ESC and check that everything looks good with the continuity meter. When I check this, I don't get a 0 value showing a short, but also don't get a 1 showing there's no continuity. I get some other value. I've seen this happen with the meter before when there's not a problem. As I said earlier, it's checking resistance, and I've had motors being wired up affect this. So in general, if I don't get 0, it's usually good, but I still don't assume that is the case, and I use a smoke stopper when I connect the battery just in case. So it seems that something is wrong as everything is not powered on when I plug in the battery. I'm sure I have everything right, but maybe I have something wrong with the wire that connects to the SC and the flight controller. Did I not get it plugged in fully? Did I plug it in backwards? Surely I didn't plug it in backwards. The plug should prevent that, right? I check everything, And then it finally dawns on me. The FC is designed to be on top of the SC, and as a result, when I have the flight controller mounted behind it, the wire that goes between the FC and the SC is actually twisted. So I did have it plug in backwards. Once I realized that and checked again, it's now all good. Everything powers on. There are some key points that I like to reinforce in my builds, and those are the solder or plug connections into the VTX and the MIPI cable connection to the VTX. The way I typically reinforce these is to use some E6000 glue globbed over it. For whatever reason on this day, I decided to use hot glue. Most of the time it'll probably be okay, but just to be safe, don't do what I did here and just use E6000. So with the VTX wiring secured, let's go ahead and get the receiver ready. I had used this receiver before in a different build, so it already had wires soldered to it, but the wires are not quite long enough to reach from the front of the Acrobat all the way to the back. There's a couple options here. One option is to change the location of the receiver antenna, but I like its position at the front of the drone, so that means I need to lengthen the wires. I could remove the existing wires to get some longer ones, and then solder those to the receiver, or I could just solder some extension wires to the existing wires. This is the option I chose as it's the simplest of the soldering options. I've had so much trouble doing this, and I tried a few ways, but ultimately came to the realization that you want to do a side-by-side solder connection for a clean and durable connection. It takes a little bit of practice, but once you do it a few times, it's pretty straightforward. A set of helping hands is a must for this though. The basic idea is that you tin the ends that you're going to connect, hold the ends next to one another, and then apply the soldering iron tip to both as they touch. The solder will flow together, and then you remove the iron while holding the wire steady for a few seconds as the solder cools. For these ends, it's useful to expose more wire than you typically would, so you have a good bit of surface area to bond. After they are connected, cut a bit of heat shrink and apply it over the joint. And like we did with the other wires, we twist them together to keep them neat and tidy, but it also reduces electrical noise. Let's take a break from soldering for a second to install some Kapton tape. I found this stuff from Ryan Quellet, and this has proven to be an incredible tip for improving durability in a drone, particularly drones where components have to be in close proximity to one another, and exposed metal surfaces could end up touching if things get jostled a bit too much in a crash. What we want to do is apply this tape over the top of the ESC so that it prevents the VTX from touching the ESC in a crash. It would probably be a good idea to put this on the underside of the ESC as well, but I didn't in this case. I run one strip from the front to the back in between the standoff screws and let it hang over the edge of the SC a bit, and then apply a second piece perpendicular to this one to cover the motor wire pads. Again, I cut it a little long so that it hangs over the ends a bit. Back to soldering, and we're going to connect our beeper. Now a beeper is essential, and a battery backed up beeper is the best option. I used to not use a beeper. I didn't really see the point. Based on where I was flying, I figured I was always close by and was paying attention to where I was when I was flying, so I should be able to easily find it, right? And for the most part, that was always the case, until I moved to Florida. Prior to this, I did have a few times where I nearly lost my drone after a crash and spent a good bit of time searching, but it still didn't convince me to get a beeper. After moving to Florida, though, I met my good friend Flo Rida, and we started to go flying in a lot of places. Well, on one trip, we were flying in this park that had a good bit of tall weeds all over the place. I ended up crashing, and my battery ejected, and I really wasn't sure where I was. My buddy told me, "I'll help you find it this time, but if you don't get a beeper, you are on your own next time." After a long search, we found it. I purchased beepers that evening. I got away from them again with these small builds, mostly because I couldn't find a place to fit them. But after nearly losing it a few times, I decided to see if I could find something that fits, and I ended up finding these ViFly mini beepers. They are already proved themselves useful in so many times. With the beeper connected, we can now solder the receiver in. You may be wondering why I didn't do this earlier, so I'll let you know. The layout of the FC and its position in the drone make it easier to connect the beeper first and then the receiver. The receiver pads are at the rear, so if I connect the receiver first, the wires will be in my way a bit when I connect the beeper wires. I like to double check things a lot when I'm building. I've made so many dumb mistakes in the past, so I like to double and triple check and quadruple check the pads I'm using and which one is which. Plus, I'm old, so my memory isn't the best. Okay, maybe it's not that bad, but it feels that way sometimes with as many times as I check the pads I'm using and which one is which. I also religiously make use of the smoke stopper. This is an invaluable tool. There's not much worse than thinking everything is good only to find that magic smoke gets released when you plug the battery in. Or worse, the magic smoke is released along with a bit of flames. I've experienced both, so I try to avoid that these days with the smoke stopper and checking things with the meter as well. It doesn't hurt to eyeball things with the magnifying glass either. With all the soldering completed, we're getting close to being done with this build. We'll start to button things up and then test the electronics and more importantly the video system to make sure that everything is good, again, before we finish up the build and do the maiden flight. As I mentioned earlier, I ditched the included mounting hardware that comes with the frames. When I got into the hobby a lot of years back, one of the common things that was done was to use nylon mounting hardware. This was mostly done in those days to prevent shorting of components. Most components didn't have rubber grommets, so it was really easy to short the bores to the frame if you were not using the nylon mounting hardware. The downside, of course, is it's not very durable. So these days, everyone pretty much uses metal screws. Most probably use aluminum as it's usually durable enough and lighter. I prefer steel though, as I have bent my fair share of aluminum standoffs and screws. Interestingly, I use nylon nuts though. The nylon nuts work well at holding without loosening from vibrations. I have used nylock nuts on builds as well, but in general the nylon nuts work well and are easier to find. One addition I have started doing though is to use nylon washers. This comes in really handy for this build as the rubber grommets on the VTX are designed for M3 screws, but the holes on the Acrobat are all M2. So with the M2 nylon washer on it, it provides a nice way to prevent the nut from getting pulled through the larger hole grommet. Let's check the video system to make sure that we have video and OSD, and let's also make sure that the motors are spinning the right way. This is one place that makes me tempted to pick up the new HD0 screen. It would make this sort of testing a lot simpler to do, but it does have a bit of a hefty price tag. Maybe a cheaper option will come out at some point. Video looks good, so let's check the motors. I run the motors so that props spin outward. Everything looks good. So with the video looking good, I'm ready to get the camera mounted into the adapter so I can put it into the drone. And this is when I realized that there was a problem. This camera had been used before and had been in a number of crashes, but from a cursory glance, everything seemed to be okay with it. That was until I decided to attempt to put screws into it. That's when I realized the threads on one of the holes were stripped, so I had to purchase a new camera. And this was when I decided to go ahead and upgrade to the new HD0 V3 Micro. These moments of disassembly are what I try to avoid when I'm building, but sometimes you just can't prevent every potential issue you will run into with a build. Thankfully in this case it wasn't too bad, and at least I caught it before I had glued the MIPI cable to the VTX. And you may be thinking that wouldn't have been too much of an issue because I could remove the MIPI from the camera side. And that's where you would be wrong, because this camera has the backside filled with glue because I was having issues with little pieces of debris sneaking into this case. So I finally got tired of dealing with that and took extreme measures. Building and repairing drones is the one aspect of this hobby that always brings me to the point of considering my life's choices. There have been so many times during one of these builds or repair sessions that I truthfully considered just getting out of the hobby and finding something else to do with my time. The Acrobat uses rubber grommets on the side plates of the frame. If you are relatively new to the FP hobby or unaware of the history of frame design, this may seem a bit odd to you. Early on in the history of FPV, when people started putting GoPros and other action cameras on their drones, they routinely faced a common enemy, and that enemy was jello, or vibrations in their captured footage. A common design element that surfaced from these battles was to create what was known as clean and dirty plates in the frame. Basically, a clean plate separated from the dirty vibration-filled plate using rubber grommets. These rubber grommets isolated the vibrations from the props and motors from getting to the GoPro. This resulted in vibration-free camera footage. These grommets worked well, and this technique eventually made its way to electronic components, flight controller and 4-in-1 ESCs. For the same reason, less vibration getting to those components results in better flying drones. Let's do one last check of the video to make sure it's all good before we glue the MIPI connector to the VTX. Again, I want to point out, don't use hot glue here. Use E6000 glue. It's much better as it can handle the heat, and you can remove it easily by applying some 100% alcohol spray to it and peeling it off. In either case, applying some heat from a heat gun at this point helps to spread the glue a bit to make a solid bond. I'm going to spare you a bit of my talking for the next 3 minutes or so and let you enjoy watching me struggle to determine which length of standoff screw I should be using. In the end, I come back to the original length I had, but with added nylon washers. I'll join you again in a few minutes. With everything almost done, I thought I would take this moment to ask you if you see anything I could do better with this build. Is there anything that I've done that you would never do because you have a better way? Did you learn anything? I've watched a lot of different styles of build videos, and I always find them interesting, and I always come away with some new tips and tricks to use in future builds. Is this an interesting style of build video? I have watched and created detailed build videos. I've watched ones that highlight just certain things and fast forward through most of the build, but I don't think I've watched a video like this where I talk about the build, but not so much about the details while the build is fast forwarded through. For the antenna placement, I toyed with a few locations. I have used the Acrobat frame for a while, and I have a good bit of time to try different placements. The location that I found to be the best overall for reception is on the standoff that is just above the camera. It gets the antenna above the carbon and gives a good line of sight to the antenna regardless of the drone's orientation or my position relative to where I'm controlling it from. I've tried it at the rear in line with the base plate of the frame, but it's too close to the VTX and causes some interference. The best compromise has been at the front in line with the base plate, just slightly above it. It has proven to be very durable in this location, and reception has been remarkably good, even at a pretty good range. The Mini Immortal T doesn't have far range, but with this position, even its short range hasn't really been reduced. And now we're going to try and get the camera settings configured, and it's at this point that I get really frustrated with HD0. I'm trying to use stick commands to get into the camera settings, but when I do, the settings are completely missing. You can see the setting name, there's no value shown. You can't change any of the values. So I figure, okay, this new camera needs an updated firmware. Now, I'm not one to just upgrade firmware for the sake of having the latest and greatest, so once I have something working, I leave it be. But in this case, it's not working, so I have to update it. And then I can no longer get to the settings. I downgraded back to what I was using, and the settings been used back, but blank again. So clearly, I need the new firmware. But when I do that, I can no longer get to the menu. It is off to Discord to see what the heck is going on. I found out they had previously had a bug that caused folks to inadvertently pop up the camera settings while flying, and so they fixed that, and as a result, it requires that you have your sticks placed just right to enter the menu. Okay, no problem. I tried that. Still nothing. Roll back firmware one at a time and try every single version between where I was and the latest version, and I had the same result. And then it finally dawned on me. I had configured my controller to keep the throttle stick at 0 until armed. So with the arm switch in the disarm position, I could not set the throttle to mid, and therefore couldn't enter the camera settings menu. I corrected that, and voila, I got the camera settings, and they're working as expected. Moments like this make one question one's choice of hobby. With everything complete, let's weigh it and get to flying. We're all good and just under 250 grams weight with my heaviest battery. Let the maiden begin. Maiden was a success. I'll see you guys in the next video, and remember, never stop flying.